Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
Fighting on a rival, fighting for survival, fighting on a rival, fighting for survival, fighting on a rival, fighting for survival, rival, 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 rival.
Who is Cuddles, and what is his story? How did he become one of the top faces in one of the most notorious football firms that English football has produced? For many football supporters across Britain during the 1980s, that question would have been answered in exactly the same way. He was the man at the front, the man giving the orders, the man who never seemed to lose his nerve, the man who helped transform Birmingham City's Zulu Warriors from a collection of scattered crews and local gangs into one of the most feared football firms in the country. But was that reputation deserved? Was Cuddles really the hard man many claim he was? Or has time turned him into something bigger than the reality? To understand the truth, you have to go back to a very different Birmingham, a city that looked different, sounded different, and perhaps most importantly, thought differently. Long before designer labels, long before Stone Island became football culture's unofficial uniform, and long before the Zulus became known nationwide, Birmingham was a city divided into countless territories. Every estate had its own loyalties. Every area had its own crew. And crossing from one neighbourhood into another could be enough to start trouble. For a young lad growing up in Birmingham during the late 1970s, football was only one part of life. The streets themselves could be dangerous, particularly if you stood out, particularly if you were different, and particularly if you happened to be black. Cuddles knew that reality better than most. Long before he became a recognised figure amongst Birmingham City supporters, he was simply another teenager trying to navigate a city that often felt hostile. One memory would stay with him for years. He was walking home from Solihull one day. Nothing unusual, no trouble, no football, no confrontation. Then he noticed a special patrol group van creeping behind him, slowly, deliberately, watching. Inside sat several police officers. They weren't responding to a crime. They weren't searching for suspects. They were following him. Cuddles later recalled seeing the officers inside wearing black gloves as they crawled along behind him. He tried to ignore them, kept walking, kept his head down, but he knew exactly what was happening. The officers began laughing. One shouted out of the van, "Been robbing houses, have we?" The others laughed. Cuddles replied that he'd simply been in Solihull, nothing more. Eventually, the van pulled ahead and drove off. But the message had already been delivered. You were never allowed to forget where you stood. Experiences like that weren't unusual. For many youngsters in Birmingham during that period, football violence wasn't the only threat. There were racial tensions everywhere. Skinhead gangs driving around estates, groups looking for confrontations, street violence that had nothing whatsoever to do with football. Cuddles would later admit that whenever he went out, he often carried bottles hidden up his sleeves. Not because he planned trouble, but because trouble often found you. Sometimes all it took was answering back when abuse was shouted from a passing car. Brakes would slam, doors would open, and suddenly you found yourself fighting for survival. Those experiences shaped him. They shaped an entire generation, and perhaps more importantly, they shaped the culture that would eventually become the Zulus. At that stage, Birmingham City's support wasn't united. Far from it. The city itself was fragmented. Different areas hated one another. Chelmsley Wood had its own reputation. Shard End had theirs. Kingshurst, Lea Hall, Acox Green, Northfield, Kings Norton, Small Heath, Billesley. Each had their own groups. Each had their own identities. And many of them disliked one another almost as much as they disliked rival football supporters. There were rows, fights, arguments, old grudges, new grudges, some lasting weeks, others lasting years. For a football firm to become truly powerful, all of those divisions would eventually need to disappear. But at the time, nobody knew that. Nobody was thinking about creating one of Britain's most feared firms. Most were simply concerned with surviving the weekend. One area in particular developed a fearsome reputation: Chelmsley Wood. Stories spread across Birmingham about the youths from the estate. Some lads would literally travel there on buses simply to see what the place was like, if they were brave enough. The trooper mob often sat outside waiting. Bricks would be launched at passing buses. Visitors were challenged, and anyone looking for easy pickings quickly discovered they had come to the wrong place. On one occasion, when a travelling fair arrived in Chelmsley Wood, 2 busloads of lads from Northfield appeared. Many suspected they had come looking for trouble. If that was their intention, it didn't end well. They were chased, beaten, and sent home. The message was simple. This wasn't somewhere you visited unless you were prepared for consequences. While all this was happening, another influence was beginning to emerge: music. For many football supporters of that era, music and football became inseparable, and nowhere was that more obvious than Birmingham. Cuddles wasn't just a football lad. Most of his friends were punks. They listened to everything: the Sex Pistols, the Stranglers, Blondie, the Whispers, Eddie Grant. Whatever sounded good, whatever felt different, whatever belonged to them. Then something happened that would influence an entire generation. Two-tone exploded. The Specials, the Beat, the Selector. Madness. A musical movement that brought together black and white youngsters at a time when much of Britain seemed determined to pull them apart. Suddenly, football lads, punks, rude boys, and skinheads found themselves dancing to the same records, dressing similarly, sharing the same clubs, the same venues, the same nights out. For Birmingham's future Zulus, this mattered. Because unlike many firms around Britain, race wasn't becoming a dividing line. It was becoming something that were being forged that simply hadn't existed before. The foundations of what would eventually become the Zulus were slowly being laid. One match that left a lasting impression on many Birmingham lads came against Liverpool. European champions, one of the biggest clubs in the country. When they arrived at St Andrews in September 1978, the atmosphere was already electric long before kick-off. The weather was warm, the pubs were packed, and both sets of supporters arrived expecting a lively afternoon. What started as the usual exchange of insults and thrown coins quickly escalated. Soon, bricks were flying through the air, then pipes, bolts, anything that could be used as a missile. Workers from a nearby factory overlooking the ground reportedly began passing objects down to Birmingham supporters, effectively supplying ammunition for the battle taking place below. For a 16-year-old Cuddles, it was another lesson in how football culture operated. This wasn't simply about 90 minutes on a pitch. The game itself often felt secondary. One moment from that afternoon became almost legendary among Birmingham supporters. Amidst a pitch invasion and complete chaos, A local punk known as Potter somehow ended up with a dart embedded in the middle of his forehead. The police escorted him away with the dart still sticking out. It sounds unbelievable now. Yet moments like that summed up football in that era. Madness. Complete madness. And the violence wasn't limited to Liverpool. Chelsea were already building a fearsome reputation throughout the country. When they arrived at St Andrews, they didn't come simply to watch football. They came looking for a result. The visitors infiltrated Birmingham's Cop and Assal. Suddenly, hundreds of supporters found themselves fighting for control of the terrace. Fists flew. Bodies surged forward. Fans scattered before regrouping. Chelsea initially gained ground. Then Birmingham fought back, gradually forcing them backwards, eventually driving them towards the pitch itself. For many young lads watching that day, including future members of Apex, it was a revelation. One future Zulu later remembered standing there with his school friends watching the battle unfold. Their reaction was simple. Fucking hell, this is good. That sentence probably explains football hooliganism better than any academic study ever could, because to outsiders, it looked insane. To the youngsters watching, it looked exciting, dangerous, chaotic, but exciting. And once that fascination took hold, many never escaped it. Around this time, another important development was taking place, the creation of Apex. Long before the name Zulus became known nationwide, there was Apex. A loose collection of around 60 black and white teenagers from areas such as Ladywood, Sparkbrook, Bordersley Green, Lee Bank and Highgate. Unlike many firms around Britain, Apex wasn't built around one estate, nor was it built around race. It brought together lads from multiple backgrounds, multiple neighbourhoods, multiple cultures. And that made it different, very different. In many parts of Britain, football firms were overwhelmingly white. In Birmingham, something unique was happening. Black and white youngsters were standing shoulder to shoulder, travelling together, fighting together, and defending one another. That unity would eventually become one of the defining features of the Zulus. But first, they had to earn respect, and respect wasn't given. It had to be taken. One of the first firms to leave a serious impression on Cuddles and his mates came from Nottingham. When Nottingham Forest visited St Andrews in 1981, many Birmingham lads expected the usual away support. Instead, they encountered something else entirely. A coachload of Forest supporters arrived looking organised and ready. The confrontation began before the game had even started. A brick smashed through a coach window. Glass exploded everywhere. The driver slammed on the brakes. The coach doors were forced to open. Within seconds, the two firms were facing each other in the middle of the road. The standoff didn't last long. Forest supporters began climbing through the smashed windows. Punches were thrown, bodies collided. The fight lasted only a few minutes before police intervened, but it left an impression. Forest weren't tourists. Forest weren't casual supporters. They were game. After the match, events escalated further. A small Birmingham group, including Cuddles, encountered the same Forest lads again in Digbeth. This time, there were no barriers, no coaches, no police lines. Just two firms facing each other. Outnumbered, Cuddles signalled for reinforcements. The Forest lads disappeared before they could be found again. But Birmingham had learned something important. Some firms travelled to watch football, others travelled to fight. Forest belonged firmly in the second category. As the years passed, Cuddles became increasingly recognised within Birmingham circles. Not because he shouted the loudest, not because he claimed to be the hardest, but because he repeatedly showed up. week after week, trip after trip. When things kicked off, he was there. That reputation mattered, especially during a period when many talked a good game but disappeared when trouble arrived. One example came at Manchester United. Thousands of Birmingham supporters travelled north for the opening game of the season. The atmosphere inside Old Trafford was hostile from the beginning. When a small group of United supporters celebrated inside the Birmingham section, most people simply watched. Cuddles didn't. He pushed through the crowd and charged straight into them, alone. For a few moments he traded punches with multiple United supporters before being overwhelmed. Police dragged him out and ejected him from the stadium. The remainder of the match was spent standing outside on his own. No glory, no dramatic victory, just a stubborn refusal to back down. Again and again these stories emerged. Not tales of invincibility, not tales of easy wins, stories of someone willing to stand his ground, and that was what people remembered. Perhaps the biggest test of all came in London. West Ham, one of the most feared names in British football culture. For many young Birmingham lads, travelling to face West Ham was almost a rite of passage. Cuddles remembered arriving with a small group and finding themselves surrounded. The situation looked grim. West Ham had the numbers. Birmingham didn't. Nobody would have blamed them for keeping quiet. Instead, Cuddles stood up. Come on then. Simple, direct. No speeches, no theatrics. According to him, the West Ham lads looked at him and then chose not to attack. Whether it was respect, curiosity, or simply a decision that the odds weren't worth it. Nobody knows. But the moment stayed with him. And more importantly, it stayed with others. Because stories travel quickly within football culture, especially stories involving bottle. By now, the various Birmingham groups were beginning to merge more effectively. The older generation, the younger generation, the lads from different estates, the lads from different backgrounds. The more they travelled together, the more united they became. Court appearances, away trips, shared battles, all helped create stronger bonds. The firm was evolving, growing, learning, yet they still lacked one thing: organisation, and that weakness would soon be brutally exposed by one of the most respected firms in Britain, Tottenham Hotspur. The day Spurs came to St Andrews would become one of the most important moments in Birmingham hooligan history. Not because Birmingham won, because they didn't. And sometimes defeat teaches more than victory ever can. The lesson that day would change everything, and it would ultimately turn Cuddles from a respected face within the crowd into the man who would lead one of the most feared firms Britain had ever seen. The truth was, Tottenham had exposed a weakness that many Birmingham lads had suspected existed for some time. The bottle was there. The numbers were there. The willingness to fight was certainly there. But organisation, that was another matter entirely. When Spurs arrived at St Andrews in 1984, Birmingham expected a lively afternoon. Tottenham supporters already carried a serious reputation around the country. Their travelling contingent was respected, feared, and, perhaps most importantly, disciplined. The Zulus, by comparison, were still finding their feet. They had numbers, they had enthusiasm, but they didn't yet operate as one unit. That would prove costly. Around 60 Birmingham lads positioned themselves behind the goal where Tottenham supporters were gathering. Initially, the police kept both sides apart, but as kick-off approached, more and more Spurs supporters filtered into the surrounding areas. The numbers began to swing dramatically. 20 more Birmingham lads arrived, then more Tottenham, Soon there were hundreds of Londoners surrounding them. Cuddles later admitted that Birmingham simply weren't organised enough. There were plenty of lads at the ground. The problem was, they weren't in the right places. Nobody was coordinating anything. Nobody really knew who was where. Then it kicked off. The chants started. Tottenham! Zulu! And within seconds, fists were flying. But Tottenham had come prepared. Suddenly, Birmingham supporters found themselves engulfed by a powerful smell. Ammonia. Spurs supporters had brought sprays with them and were using them during the confrontation. Eyes burned. People stumbled backwards. Vision became blurred. Even experienced lads found themselves struggling. The fight continued regardless. Toe-to-toe. No retreat. No surrender. But eventually, the police waded in and separated the two groups. For Birmingham, it felt like a defeat. Not because they had been physically destroyed, because they realised they had been outthought, out-organised, out-prepared. That hurt more. Long after the fighting stopped, the frustration remained. Cuddles found himself wandering around the ground, feeling angry. The opportunity had been there. The numbers had been there. Yet somehow, Tottenham had achieved what few firms ever managed at St Andrews. They had earned a result. Outside the ground, Birmingham eventually regained some pride, chasing Tottenham supporters around the city and forcing numerous confrontations. But the damage had already been done. In pubs afterwards, the arguments began. Voices were raised, accusations were made, questions were asked. What had gone wrong? Why weren't lads where they were supposed to be? Why were Birmingham constantly relying on bravery instead of planning? Most importantly, who was actually in charge? The uncomfortable answer was nobody. And that had to change. The discussions continued long into the evening. Several names were suggested, several candidates considered. Again and again, the conversation returned to one individual, Cuddles. At first, he wasn't interested. Leadership brought pressure, responsibility, expectations, and problems. Lots of problems. But the more people spoke, the clearer it became. He occupied a unique position within Birmingham's football culture. The older lads respected him. The younger lads followed him. He knew people from different areas, different estates, different generations. Few others could claim the same. Eventually, he agreed, but only on one condition. If he was going to do it, people had to listen. No more chaos. No more everyone doing their own thing. No more Birmingham fighting amongst themselves while rival firms benefited. The Zulus needed structure. And from that moment, everything changed. The transformation wasn't instant. It didn't happen overnight. But gradually, Birmingham began operating like a proper organisation. Information flowed more efficiently. Meeting points became coordinated. Travel became coordinated. Different groups started working together instead of competing with one another. Trusted lieutenants emerged around Cuddles. Men who could be relied upon. Men who commanded respect in their own right. People like Wally and others helped maintain discipline and communication throughout the growing firm. The old divisions slowly disappeared. Acox Green, Chelmsley Wood, Kings Norton, Leah Hall, Bordersley Green, Small Heath. The focus shifted. They weren't representing individual estates anymore. They were representing Birmingham. And word began spreading across England, across football, across the hooligan scene. Something was happening in Birmingham. Something serious. The timing couldn't have been better. Because the mid-1980s represented the absolute peak of football hooliganism in Britain. almost every club seemed to possess a recognised firm. Every away trip carried potential danger. Every railway station, every city centre, every pub, every match day. Conflict felt inevitable, and Birmingham were rapidly becoming one of the firms everyone talked about. The 1984-85 season became a whirlwind. Oldham was among the first major flashpoints. When Birmingham arrived, disorder erupted almost immediately. Supporters forced their way through entrances. Police struggled to maintain control. Missiles flew. Officers were injured. The scenes resembled public disorder rather than a football match. One newspaper even reported the arrest of a Birmingham supporter carrying a cabbage filled with metal spikes. Only football in the 1980s could produce a sentence like that. For Cuddles and the Zulus, however, the memories were different. What many remembered most vividly wasn't the fighting, it was the police dogs. One supporter ended up being bitten in the most unfortunate place imaginable. Another suffered serious injuries to his legs. Stories like these became legendary within Birmingham circles, retold countless times in pubs, coaches and trains, partly because they were frightening, partly because they were funny, and often because they were both. Every away trip seemed to generate another story, another incident, another memory. At Fulham, there were fence climbing attempts, scuffles and running battles with police. At Crystal Palace, there was relatively little action, although the journey home produced one of the more bizarre moments of the season when members of Birmingham's younger generation hijacked a train announcement system and proudly informed passengers that the service had been taken over by the Zulu Warriors. It was ridiculous, childish, and absolutely typical of the era. Yet beneath the humour, something more significant was happening. The firm's confidence was growing. Every successful away trip strengthened their reputation. Every confrontation reinforced the belief that Birmingham could compete with anybody. Then came Leeds, one of the fixtures everybody had been waiting for. Because Leeds weren't just another firm, they were Leeds. And Elland Road wasn't a place many clubs enjoyed visiting. As Birmingham supporters stepped off the train, they were greeted almost immediately by Leeds service crew. The challenge had arrived. The famous Zulu chant echoed through the station. Passengers scattered. The charge began. For a brief moment, chaos reigned. Supporters sprinted through the station and into the surrounding streets. Leeds ran. Birmingham chased. Police scrambled to restore order. Eventually, the authorities regained control, escorting hundreds of Birmingham supporters directly to the ground. But the point had been made. The Zulus weren't intimidated, not by Leeds, not by anyone. Inside Elland Road, tensions remained high. Leeds supporters responded with Nazi salutes and racist gestures, something Birmingham's multiracial support encountered regularly across the country. In many northern towns, the racial abuse wasn't subtle. It was open, direct, and relentless. For some firms, that abuse might have created division. For Birmingham, it often achieved the opposite. It strengthened their unity. Every insult reinforced the idea that they were different. Different from London, different from the North. Different from almost everyone else in football, and that difference became a source of pride. By now, rival firms increasingly recognised one simple fact. If Birmingham arrived in numbers, there was a very good chance trouble would follow. And at the centre of it all stood Cuddles. Not as some mythical warrior, not as an undefeated hardman, but as the figure who had managed to bring together dozens of rival crews and transform them into a single force. The transformation was remarkable, yet the biggest tests were still ahead. because soon Birmingham would find themselves facing not only rival firms, but racism, massive away mobs, some of the toughest firms in Britain, and the challenges that come with becoming one of the biggest names in the entire hooligan scene. And as their reputation grew, so did the target on their backs. By the mid-1980s, Birmingham City's hooligan scene was no longer a loose collection of estate crews, schoolmates, and local hard cases. Under Cuddles, it had become something else entirely. What had started as dozens of separate groups from places like Acox Green, Chelmsley Wood, Bordesley Green, Small Heath, Kings Norton, and Sheldon was now operating as one firm. There were still disagreements, there were still rivalries, but when an away day came around, everyone knew where they stood. And that was exactly what Cuddles had wanted. The lesson learned from Tottenham had stuck. Organisation mattered. Numbers mattered. Discipline mattered. And perhaps most importantly of all, reputation mattered. Word travelled fast around the football scene. One good result could make people notice you. A season full of results could make people fear you. The Zulus were now building that reputation week after week. Wherever Birmingham travelled, people knew there was a chance trouble would follow. Not because every game kicked off, but because everybody knew Birmingham would never back down if it did. For Cuddles, that responsibility was enormous. He wasn't some criminal mastermind. He wasn't some mythical warrior. He was still working during the week like everybody else. But every Friday and Saturday, people looked towards him. People wanted direction. People wanted leadership. People wanted to know where to meet, which pubs to use, which stations to avoid, which routes to take, and most importantly, who they were likely to face. As the firm grew larger, so did the pressure. The story spread further. The reputation spread wider. And before long, Birmingham City were no longer being judged against local rivals. They were being judged against the biggest names in the country. West Ham, Millwall, Chelsea, Manchester United, Leeds, Tottenham, the firms everyone talked about, the firms everybody measured themselves against. And increasingly, Birmingham were entering those conversations. What made them different was that they weren't built around one estate. They weren't built around one race. They weren't built around one social class. They were a mixture of everything Birmingham itself represented. Black lads, white lads, Asian lads, city centre kids, estate kids, working lads, school kids, factory workers, apprentices, the lot. It created a unique identity, an identity that stood out wherever they travelled, and it also meant they attracted more abuse than most firms. Away trips into certain parts of the country could be hostile long before any punches were thrown. The racial abuse was constant, sometimes from rival supporters, sometimes from people who had never even been to a football match. Sometimes, according to several accounts, even from those supposed to be maintaining order. But, if anything, it seemed to strengthen the bonds inside the firm. The more pressure that came from outside, the tighter the group became. The younger lads watched the older generation. The junior business boys watched the Zulu Warriors, and they wanted to earn their place. The juniors were growing up fast. Many had started out simply following the older lads around after matches, watching, learning, trying not to get told to clear off. Now they were beginning to create stories of their own, trips across the country, pub confrontations, station standoffs, run-ins with rival youth firms. The next generation was arriving, and Cuddles could see it happening. He knew Birmingham needed fresh faces, needed fresh blood. Because football culture was changing, fashion was changing, Policing was changing. The entire country was changing. The old skinhead era was fading. The casual era was exploding. Designer clothing had become part of the identity. A football firm was no longer judged purely on what happened when things kicked off. People looked at what you wore, how you carried yourself, whether you looked the part, whether you belonged. The Birmingham lads embraced it. Burberry, Best Company, Aquascutum, Adidas, Nike, Armani, Stone Island. The labels became badges of honour, and just like everything else, Birmingham wanted to compete with the best. If London firms looked sharp, Birmingham wanted to look sharper. If Manchester firms had style, Birmingham wanted more. The fashion became another battlefield, another way of proving yourself, another way of standing out. And while outsiders often focus solely on the violence, many who lived through the era remember something else. The friendships, the laughs, the journeys, the adventures, the ridiculous situations, the stories that could only happen following football. For every serious confrontation, there seemed to be 10 absurd moments. People ending up hundreds of miles from home, missing trains, losing mates, getting chased through unfamiliar cities, sleeping in stations, taking wrong turns, ending up in completely the wrong place. The stories became legends, retold in pubs, retold at matches, retold years later with half the details forgotten and the other half exaggerated. And right at the centre of many of those stories sat Cuddles, sometimes leading from the front, sometimes trying to keep people together, sometimes finding himself in situations that even he would later laugh about. Yet, despite all the madness, one thing remained constant: his reputation. Talk to people who knew him. Talk to people who travelled with him. Talk to people who stood alongside him. And the same themes appear again and again. Game, respected, fearless, reliable. Not someone who hid. Not someone who disappeared when things became difficult. Not someone who talked a good game and then vanished when it mattered. Whether people agreed with everything that happened during those years is another matter entirely. Football hooliganism left injuries, criminal records, prison sentences, victims, regrets. Many people walked away from it. Others paid heavy prices. And by the late 1980s, the entire landscape was beginning to change. The authorities were responding. Policing was becoming more sophisticated. Surveillance was increasing. The old days were slowly disappearing. But when people discuss Birmingham City's hooligan history, one name keeps returning: Cuddles. Not because he claimed to be the hardest, not because he claimed to be unbeatable, but because he happened to be the figurehead during the period when the Zulus transformed from a collection of local crews into one of the most feared firms in Britain. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with a teenager walking home from Solihull, being followed by an SPG van. It continued through the chaos of the late 1970s. The Liverpool game, the Chelsea battles, the rise of Apex, the birth of the Zulus, the emergence of the junior business boys, the away days, the confrontations, the victories, the setbacks, the lessons learned, and ultimately, the decision after that Tottenham game when somebody needed to take responsibility, when somebody needed to bring everyone together, when somebody needed to lead. According to those who were there, that somebody was Cuddles. So who was Cuddles? He was a Birmingham City supporter from Acox Green, a product of a divided city that eventually united behind one football firm. A teenager who grew up during one of the most turbulent periods in British football history. a football hooligan, a figurehead, a leader, a character who became woven into the folklore of Birmingham City's most notorious era. And decades later, whether viewed as a symbol of loyalty, leadership, violence, controversy, or simply a product of his time, his name still survives in football stories across the country. For many Birmingham supporters, that alone tells you everything you need to know. Because in a world where reputations were earned face to face rather than online, where every away day carried uncertainty, where respect couldn't be demanded and had to be won, very few names lasted. Cuddles did. And that is why, all these years later, football fans are still asking the same question. Who exactly was Cuddles? I have now covered Terrace legends such as Oathead, Eddie Beef, Pat Dolan, Pete the Greek, and now Cuddles. Who would you like to see featured in a video? Let me know in the comments section. People have started reaching out to me with videos, pictures, and stories. I have been sent some good stuff, which I will use in some upcoming videos. People are finding me through Facebook by typing in everything casual, and then my page is popping up. You can message me from there. Thank you as always to everyone that has taken the time to watch this video. I appreciate it. See you next time.